So welcome to today's workshop with Dr. Anthony Métivier. And without further ado, I'll let Dr. Anthony Métivier teach us incredible techniques how we can improve our memory. Anthony?
Thank you. I've got a headset here. So yeah, thank you, Stefan, for the introduction and also for the invitation to come and give this talk. It's pretty exciting to be giving a presentation of this scale, and I really want to congratulate everybody for showing up and being here and being interested in improving the quality of your mind. It's not really just about having memory techniques. It's about doing a complete re-engineering of the potential of what you can do with your mind, and it has deep impact throughout your entire system, so to speak, and your life. So I really just want to start with a bit of history, just so that everybody knows where I'm coming from. I like to talk about memory palaces. There are all kinds of memorization techniques, and I think that memory palaces are the most profound for reasons that we'll go through in the course, but I want to sort of ground it in a bit of history. So Simonides of Ceos, or some people pronounce it chaos, was a guy in 546 to 468 he lived, and he was an orator and did different things. And this is possibly just a legend, but it's still a very important legend because it can teach us something about how and why memory skills work, in addition to giving us the history of memory skills. So in any case, Simonides was invited to a banquet, and he was giving a speech, different versions of different stories, talk about exactly what he was talking about. I like to think that he was teaching memory skills, but in any case, he was there, and he was called out through the door, and as he was outside, in some versions of the story he may have been inside, the building collapsed, and later he was able to recount exactly where all the victims in the rubble were because he had essentially memorized where they were. So the point about Simonides memorizing where people were and being able to recall to the authorities where the bodies were really gives the origin of the memory palace as we've come to know it, because he's using location to store information. He stored the different people that were at the banquet, and he also used that same location to revisit the memory of where the people were and recall who they were because of where they were positioned. And this is a tremendously powerful technique. It's really a major concept, and it's one that allows you to leverage the mind's ability, the ability of the mind to actually do something it does anyway, which is mentally organize space. As I'm standing in this room, there's cameras, there's tables, there's people, and the mind is just automatically imprinting all of this stuff. So I can navigate this room very easily, and I'll probably never forget this room because of certain principles of spatial organization and the mind's ability to just rapidly consume that information, so to speak, and then reproduce it almost at will. So in principle, this room is now a potential memory palace that I could use at any time because of this mind's natural ability to organize space in that way and recall it very easily. So what's essentially happening is that you're using, when you're using a memory palace, you're using something that you already know, and it's a non-arbitrary space. It's a space that you're familiar with that you can use to create links and multiple linkages very, very easily, very, very accurately, and with efficiency and speed. And you can revisit those places later with no mental effort, or zero, next to zero mental effort, because of the fact that you're leveraging the power of the mind to recall things. So again, there's a camera there, there's a camera there. If I were to place memorized information there and there, my mind just goes there. There's almost zero effort. The only effort is in actually taking that step and doing that. So non-arbitrary, and I mean non-arbitrary for reasons that we'll get into later when we talk about fantasy memory palaces and things based on virtual elements that we can draw upon. Non-arbitrary means that you are familiar with it. And so Simonides was familiar with this banquet hall, in other words. So when he was reconstructing the names of the people who had died in the collapse of the building, he was using a non-arbitrary space. He was familiar with it. And your non-arbitrary spaces are multiple. There are endless possibilities in your life now, in your past, and in your future. So these include your home, the homes of your relatives, the homes of your friends, libraries, movie theaters, hotels, grocery stores. It really never ends. You can go to new places to visit all sorts of things. If you're on a university campus, you could just visit a part of the campus you've never been to, and you will discover new memory palaces, and merely by paying attention to them, they can be leveraged. So that list never ends. And so non-arbitrary place is really much sexier in terms of terminology with the term memory palace. And memory palace is a specific term that a lot of people don't like, and I think it turns people off. So there was a person, one of my readers, who really fascinated me. He said, I can't even get started with this because I hate the term memory palace so much. And I said, well, come up with another one. And so he pondered, and he really wanted to get started with this. And ultimately, the cure is that he started to call them apartments with compartments. And the point is don't let the term memory palace turn you off. Come up with some alternative thing. In German, you can say Erinnerungspalast, or maybe Gedächtnisgebäude. I'm sure in your language there's some sort of equivalent to memory palace, or just make something up, as this person did. Now, where exactly does this term memory palace come from, and why is it something to consider? It probably originates with St. Augustine, who was a dude that some people have heard of, I'm sure. And he, in one of his writings in the Confessions, he talked about the praetori memorae. And he basically says in one passage in the Confessions, and I come to the fields and spacious palaces of my memory, where are the treasures of innumerable images brought into it from things of all sorts, perceived by the senses. And this is a really powerful statement to pay attention to, because he's not only focusing on this location-based notion that I've been talking about, and non-arbitrary spaces, the palatial spaces of his memory, but he's also telling us that he's withdrawing, almost like money from a bank account, material that he has memorized based on his senses. So we're going to use all our senses as part of memory, placing memories in memory palaces. Now, the actual history is deeper than that. The history of using locations goes far deeper into history, and my research is new in this area, so I can't speak with the deepest possible authority, but some things that I've come across in terms of location-based memorization strategies is that there are yogic traditions that used memory palaces what I would call memory palaces, what we would call them today, is actually using locations to memorize information, such as the different rituals and movements that are involved in yoga. And you can look at Karen Armstrong's book on the Buddha for some information about that. And I'm going to use that as a leaping point to discover more about yogic traditions. Also, Buddhist traditions have used location-based memory strategies, something that the Buddhist teacher Michael Roach talks about a lot, and he talks throughout his talk, so I can't particularly give a particular citation because it's in all of his stuff. And basically the idea there is when you're learning a Buddhist meditation, some people think that you just sit and meditate, but there's actually a lot of involved in traditional Buddhist meditations, such as, you might see a vision of yourself encountering all your friends at a banquet, and you would place that in a particular part of the room, and then later you would see those same friends turning into enemies as part of the meditation, and you might see a bridge that moves into another room in the temple, in the Buddhist temple, and you would place these things, and then later maybe there's a black dog that's chasing you to remind you that death is always behind you and it's always coming. So that's part of Buddhist traditions, and the point is that they're using locations to remember the parts of the meditation, so they're mentally following it. In other words, they're using memory palaces. So when I talk about layering out these different spaces, for instance, in a Buddhist monastery that you're using to follow a meditation, or you're using some sort of location-based strategy and you're using multiple points, you're essentially dividing memory palaces into what I call stations, stops, areas, points of interest. You can call them different things. I use the word stations because I really wanted to get away from the term low-key, which is something that really mystifies a lot of people, I found, and basically gets them uninterested in memory palaces, because low-key is a non-English word and it doesn't really mean that much. It's spelled L-O-C-I. And I like stations, and I like stations because stations is another word for stops, and they're stops along a journey. So think of them as like little bus stations. And again, this is all premised upon actual journeys that you could actually take to reduce the mental effort that it takes to actually travel from place to place in your mind. So a station is a stop along a journey through a memory palace. If Simonides were in the banquet hall mentally recalling the people who are spread out, who died, unfortunately, in this story, he would start at a particular place and say, Bob was there. Of course, Bob had a different name in ancient Greece, but Bob was there, John was there, and Samson was there. So it's a journey that we're following. Now, again, I use the word stations, and there's actually two kinds of stations. There are macro stations, which are complete rooms. So if I were to use the entire room that we're in right now to memorize one thing or one set of related things, then this would be a macro station. It's the sort of larger station where information could be placed. But there are also micro stations, which is just a way of identifying, such as the camera in a room, or this table in a room, or that table in a room, and using multiple stops in a single room. So I call those micro stations, just to give a little bit of distinction, because when you're building memory palaces, you want to have some sort of strategy, and this is the strategies that I'm teaching here. I came up with all this stuff because as I was studying location-based strategies, mnemonics in general, there's all kinds of different things, I just thought, this is totally unclear. There needs to be some basis of proceeding to use these things where some terminology is provided. And so I provided it for myself, and that's what I want to share with people. And so we can think about two different kinds of stations, micro stations and macro stations. So here we could actually see a representation of both macro stations and micro stations. If this were to be your house, then you can see that each room, if you were to use each room independently for one memory, let's say, then that bathroom would be a micro station, a macro station, the bedroom would be a macro station, the living room, the kitchen, and the hallway opening up to the exit. These are all macro stations because they're entire rooms, and they can be very powerful in that way, especially when you're beginning to assign one memory to one room. But if we go forward, we'll see that we actually have the potential to use micro stations by having multiple stops in individual rooms. So that bathroom is really, really small, but nonetheless, we can use the tub and the mirror and the sink as micro stations. We can move from one to the other. And we can use the drawer, the left bedside table, the bed, the left side of the bed, the right side of the bed. You can use the right bedside table and the bookcase, and we can then go to this next room and sofa number 1, sofa number 2, window number 1, window number 2, entertainment center, and just sort of quickly go through this to show the detail that we can get into. We can have the table, the stove, the counter, the microwave, and the sink and the fridge as micro stations. And that's starting to get to be quite a lot of stations, as we can see, where we can leave a lot of information. And so in the hallway, we also have a number of stations that you can look at. As I've been talking about this, I've been sort of going through from a particular, can we go back to that previous slide? I've been talking about this in a particular way. I started at the bathroom, I went to the bedroom and so forth, and I went in a circle, you may have noticed. And I've also arranged these particular microstations in a particular linear order. So it's not just going into the bathroom and saying, well, I'll use the mirror and I'll use the tub and I'll use the sink. I've actually strategically started at the tub, then I've gone to the mirror, then the sink, so that I'm going, in this case, counterclockwise. And you'll notice as you review the PowerPoints that come with this presentation that everything is clockwise. And it's going in a circle through that memory palace in a very strategical order. And one of the reasons we do that is in order to be able to not have to think about anything. Once we've decided that order, we just move, and we are assisted by that forward movement. We know that this room is going to be used in counterclockwise order, so we just simply go from the tub to the mirror to the sink and then out into the next room. So these two principles really have to do with the linear journey. And the two principles I want to point out is not to trap yourself in a memory palace and not to cross your own path. And there's reasons for this. You'll notice that I started in the bathroom. And the bathroom is what I would call a terminal station. It's a part of the house where I can begin, or you can begin, and move in a linear manner throughout the rest of the building without ever encountering a stop. And that's very important because you always want to be able to add more stations. So if you want to go through that door later and then use a tree, use the driveway, use the mailbox, you can add that sort of stuff without really thinking about it. But if you were to trap yourself, then you got to do crazy things like jumping off balconies and passing through walls like a ghost. And we don't want to do that stuff because it causes a blip. We have to think about what comes next. As much as possible when we're planning and preparing memory palaces, we want to engineer them from the beginning so that when we're using them later, especially when we're students and we're in test situations and we're under pressure and we want to be finding things. Now, we don't need to start linear when we're recalling information. We'll talk about that later. But as part of good memory palace preparation, these are the principles and these are the rules that will get you so far ahead of the game that it'll be just miraculous. And it really doesn't take that much time sort of going into great detail here in order for you to get the principle. But it's not nearly as detailed as it seems, and there's some worksheets that you'll be getting that help you do this very quickly as you start to build your own memory palaces. The other principle is not to cross your own path. So if we go forward, let's go backwards again. One more. The principle of not crossing your own path mystifies some people that I've been teaching this to, because they think, how can I go from the bathroom, let's say, to the bedroom and then come back out of the bedroom and then into the living room without somehow weaving around myself and creating this mental confusion, because what comes next if I'm crossing my own path as I move through here? And it's actually very simply solved by not actually mentally entering the rooms. You just stand mentally, you stand at the door and you peer into the room without actually entering it. So you're looking at the tub, you're looking at the mirror, you're looking at the sink, and then you move to looking at the bureau or the bedside table, and without actually entering that room. Now, you can enter that room if you want to, but it's really just a matter of glancing at the different stations and then finding the material that you've placed there once that we get to that point of being able to memorize material, which is coming up in the next talk. So we'll go ahead and ahead. And so here's a micro or a macro station. It's an entire room, and you will have seen this picture before in the webinar. And I used multiple stations inside of this, but if I had wanted to, this could just be a macro station. I could memorize one thing inside of it. And we'll go ahead. But I wanted to use micro stations for the example I gave in the webinar. So there's a bookcase, there's a bed, there's a desk, there's the chair, there's the wall, there's the bike, and again, all of this is linear. So you'll see that I'm very strategically making a journey where I go from one place to the next, virtually without thinking about it. And that's your goal, is to create memory palace journeys where it's absolutely a natural progression, something you could actually do. So if I were standing at the door of this memory palace, it's not bookcase, desk, bed. I'm not leapfrogging back and forth. I'm following a natural progressive journey that I could actually do with my eyes in this case. So that's a very, very important point, and I really stress it because it gives you speed and it gives you continuity and it gives you integrity in the movement. And it's also, in theater they have a theory called the economy of means, which is to never make a movement that costs more energy or more attention from the audience than necessary. It's just to simply move in an economical way. So that's what we always want to be thinking about when we're building memory palaces. Now, there's always the question about outdoor memory palaces, and I did just mention going through a door, using the driveway, a mailbox, and so forth. But in general, I like to guide people to use the interior of buildings because of how space is structured for us. Rooms have four corners, typically. Rooms have a certain amount of furniture. Maybe the furniture gets moved around at different periods in your life, but nonetheless, the furniture is more or less stable. Outdoor locations, on the other hand, tend to look like this, or they may look like this, or they may look like that, There's just a lot of chaos on, we're sort of getting that, here, I'll just step out quickly. We're getting this menu here. There. Sorry about that. So you can see that, and I wanted to make this image here very, very, very specifically of a decaying building. We can see that when we're using outdoor locations, it's certainly possible and there's ways to do it, but because there's not these pre-constructed anchor points that are very deliberately made for us, really, as a building is constructed, as we saw in that diagram of the house, that we can move from established structures. The outdoors tends to, depending on your ability, I find that they tend to decay and people have trouble with them that I've talked to. And I myself find outdoor locations very, very unusable. And I chose this picture of the building decaying on the outside because there's nothing to hold the outside up. There's nothing to really structure it. And there's traffic and there's all kinds of change and wind and stuff like that. Again, it's not a point for everybody. Some people are very successful in using outdoor locations. I talked to Phil Chambers. The interview is coming out on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. He said he personally finds no difference between indoor and outdoor locations, and that may work very well for him, and I know it does because he's a world memory champion, but I still advise for beginners to sort of try to use interior buildings so that you're not getting this kind of chaos, and we'll go to the next thing. This sort of thing where we have to constantly rebuild the memory palace as we're going along, constantly reconstruct because of the nature of outdoor locations being less well, not naturally structured, but less constructed for us. Buildings are constructed for us. So moving ahead, how do you know if a memory palace is good? Well, the basics are very simple. If you can sit down with some worksheets that will give, or just a general list that you can make, or a map that you can draw, and you can go through your mind and move from place to place in a linear manner and not really have to think about what's coming next with a minimal amount of energy, then that memory palace is most certainly good. You want to, again, be able to follow through without thinking about it. You can also identify the number of stations that you need depending on the project that you're going to work on, the memorization material that you need to have in your mind. And this is one thing that really people don't find success with, is because they build memory palaces just to have them, and they don't have a specific purpose. But one of the greatest paths to success is to actually have a purpose for the memory palaces that you're building. So if you know that you need 30 stations to memorize 30 things, then you can build a memory palace specifically for that purpose and engineer that journey so that you're actually mapping onto it exactly what you need. And we're going to talk about that in a future talk. So the real success comes from being project specific. You're building your memory palaces to respond to specific needs. Yes, of course, you can have them just for fun, spontaneous ones, like for instance, memorizing names and faces and the people that you meet. But when you're a student, you want specific memory palaces that are good for specific things, like passing tests and other things that we'll talk about. Now, one thing that I want to talk about is also that when we're building memory palaces, we want to be able to measure them, because it's known that what we measure improves, and you can measure information in advance, and we're going to get into that in deeper detail as well. But memorizing information is a very, very powerful technique when you combine it with a location-based memory strategy. So an exercise that you can get started with right away in order to get some gains, some quick gains in memory palaces, is to just draw a map of a place that you live and that you're familiar with. It could be a map of your school where you live, or sorry, where you study, or it could be a church or a movie theater or any place that feels really familiar to you, and a place that you have a positive association with, so that you're able to actually get started by visualizing it, externalizing it from your mind. And if we go ahead, I guess we can just begin to summarize. Have I gone too long for this? So to wrap up, I want to say that you want to create your first memory palace based on a familiar location. And again, familiar can be your home, it can be where you study, it can be where you work, it can be a relative's home, it can be homes of your friends, and all the different places I mentioned, hotels. You can go to a casino, and as long as you have a positive association. If you're addicted to gambling and you're trying to get away from gambling, then obviously casinos are not going to be the best sort of memory palaces for you. You want to try, when you're beginning, to give your memory palace at least 10 stations. So as a beginner, I would suggest that you use macro stations, entire rooms, and in the case of many homes, they don't have 10 rooms, but you can experiment with how you might make it 10 micro stations. So hallways are big enough. Some people have closets that are big enough to be rooms, but try to get, as a beginner, try to get yourself using bigger places in order to memorize material inside of buildings. And then you can move on to experimenting with 10 microstations inside of each room. So if you had a house that had 5 rooms, let's say, and you were able to memorize, to chart out 10 stations inside of a 5-room home, then you now have 50 stations. And that's a tremendous amount of material that you can memorize. 50 different facts, 50 different words, 50 different formulas, 50 different quiz sorts of parameters that you might need to follow up on in an exam. You want to make sure, again, that you're not trapping yourself along these journeys that you're creating. You want to make sure you're not crossing your own path, or at least limit these things, and keep in mind that you don't have to enter each of these rooms. You can look into the rooms and peer around. And you also, by linear, I really mean focusing and deciding as much as possible on some sort of circularity in a building that's leading to an exit, so that you can go outside and extend new palaces. And incidentally, when I encourage people not to go outside, and yet I'm still saying you can go outside and add things like your driveway and so forth. Another thing you can do that we're going to sort of gesture at later is you don't have to have the outside go to the outside. You could have it go to another building, right? So you can actually sort of teleport yourself to the next building. So if you had your house all designed out and you needed a next one, as you go outside the door, you could go into a classroom, or you could go into a shopping mall, or you could go in any number of places. So you don't have to follow the rules of reality necessarily, but what really does help is that in each individual memory palace, you are not trapping yourself and you're not crossing your own path. You're always able to move outward somehow. Another point is, in addition to drawing a map, I really, really recommend that you keep a top-down record. So the map is a means of visualizing what you're seeing, so that you're actually seeing a graphic representation. And you're also using your hand to do this, which is another sort of powerful technique. There's a lot of research about involving your hands in terms of mental cognition and so forth that you can look into. There's visualization going on. But a top-down record is also strategical arrangements of information that allow you to see them from a more categorical level. So you're writing down memory palace A, my home, and then you're writing down station 1, station 2, station 3, station 4, and you're able to also visualize it, but in a way that categorizes it and sees it as a list, so that your mind is seeing that linearity from a different angle. So the other thing that we want to be able to do, as I mentioned, when we're testing whether a memory palace is good or not, is to rehearse it. Actually spend some time going through that journey, making sure it's natural for you, and enabling yourself to navigate it very, very easily so that it works for the steps that are going to come when you're actually using the memory palace. Because, again, if it's not a good memory palace, it's not going to serve the purposes of recall nearly as well as it would. Though I will tell you that even the most amateur and disconnected and untrained attempts at using memory palaces without the techniques that I'm talking about will have a positive benefit and a positive effect. I was blessed to I was blessed to interview Harry Lorraine, who has been a great mentor to me through his books and his just general Harry Lorraine-ness. He's just a great positive guy, and he's affected the lives of millions of people with his memory trainings. And I was able to interview him, and he basically told me that this stuff really works for anybody, even if they just think about memory palaces, even if they just think about memory techniques. He's actually not big on memory palaces, but just thinking about memory techniques has a kind of magical power, and you begin to see that there's something that's sort of missing in your life if you're not using these. So he felt, and he told me this in this interview, that you almost cannot not have some sort of effect when you're thinking about memory palaces. But there are strategies that you can actually start to use and get beyond that initial magical effect of thinking, wow, I can actually use space to memorize things, or I can use my mind in particular ways. You can actually use it very strategically. And that's what I've hoped to give in this opening lecture, is some of the basics of the strategies in terms of actually constructing memory palaces. And we're going to go for questions if there are any.
Right, okay, so I have one question, actually from Vienna. It's Sarah, right? And she wanted to know how many memory palaces do I have to construct? Or how many memory palaces do you have yourself? Have you constructed yourself?
My count is 175, and these are obviously not always in use at all times. There's different purposes and different things that they were built for, often for experiments, but also for my dissertation, where I'm actually going to show you inside some of my dissertation memory palaces later that I used in my defense, and were also very helpful in writing as well. But in general, the amount that you need, as I talked about, is always hinged upon the project that you're using them for. So you really want to spend, and it's not an extraordinary amount of time, but you want to spend 5 or 10 minutes thinking, okay, I need to memorize, or I need to have mastery of a certain amount of material for an exam. And that could be 30 pieces of information, or that could be 100 pieces of information. It really doesn't matter. But once you begin to see it strategically and think about exactly what that information is, what its shape is, what its different forms are, what the different ins and outs of it might be, as if it were a statue or it was a block of material or a collection of blocks of material, then you can begin to think, okay, well, there's this section, and that would be very, very good for an individual memory palace. And then I need to do some vocabulary for biology, let's say, and that vocabulary is for the human head. Well, that might be a memory palace. Or if you're in political science and you're reading, say, Plato's Republic, and Plato's Republic has a number of chapters, but you really just need to focus on 9 and 10, well, then you have a memory palace for number 9 and a memory palace for number 10. Is that sort of answering the question?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. Andrew from New York, he wants to know, this kind of knowledge about memory palaces have been around since ancient Greek. So how come that the traditional schooling system have not picked it up, and why is it not taught to children nowadays as a default education?
Yeah, this is a tremendously large question, and the fact of the matter is that mnemonics does have a place in education, and it is used in different ways. Not necessarily memory palaces, but we are taught in school, or at least I was, fire drills. And we are taken through different parts of the building, and we're shown exactly where to go and what to do in terms of an emergency. And so that's not a memory palace, of course, but we're still getting location-based strategies. And we know when to go to the office. I was called to the office several times as a student to go meet with the principal and have my behavior corrected. And, I knew where the office was. They make sure you know where the office is. So in an implied way, schools do have location-based memorization strategies. But I really can't speak to exactly why that it hasn't been taken up. There's a lot of people who write me and they say, well, it's because, the state doesn't want people to be smart. They don't want people to memorize. What schools are for are training you to show up at 8:30 and leave at 2:30, or whatever the arrangement might be at the school that you go to, so that you're later as an adult perfectly trained to show up for a job at 8:30 and leave at 2:30. And while you're there, incidentally, you are there in order to fulfill certain demands upon you. So you sit quietly, you accept tasks, and then you complete those tasks in an order. So you're later able to do that without questioning anything when you're an adult, and you go and get a job, and you go to a factory, and you complete a number of tasks. That's one theory about why that there aren't any advanced learning strategies in high schools and elementary schools, is because it's a conspiracy to cause workers, to create workers. There's a lot to that. But the fact of the matter is that I really don't have a full answer to that, and it's not really anything that I would pursue in terms of research, and I would recommend not to overthink that sort of thing, because really the magic happens when we just focus on the positive, which is that this stuff does exist, and it's up to us. The onus is on us to get them into schools and get them into young people, even if we start with our own families, because things, as we know, can go viral, and we're in a mnemonics renaissance. So I'm not so much worried about that they're not in schools right now, but what we can do to get them there.
Already, there's another interesting question from Chu Tian from Hong Kong, and he wants to become a concert pianist, right?
Yeah.
Pianist, and but he's really struggling with memorizing very long pieces. Yeah, and do you have any recommendation how to memorize long pieces without being nervous and really being a natural in performing them?
I do. I'm a musician myself. I've tinkered with piano, but I'm not a pianist. The first thing to do is to start using memory techniques. Learn memory palaces. Learn as much as you can about memory techniques in general. That's the first thing to do if you want to learn to memorize musical pieces. Now, I have to be very clear that the music memorization strategies that I've been working on, coming up with, finding success with, are for bass guitar. And they are for classical pieces. I've memorized a number of cello pieces by Bach, but I've memorized them on the bass guitar. And so my memory strategies have to do with 4 strings. It has to do with fretboards, not the keyboard layout. But in general, you can make spatial relationships, and you can map the actual notation onto spatial journeys and allow yourself to recall them. What you want to do, however, is have a form of dedicated practice that you would in other things, and actually focus on small pieces, memorizing small pieces. And that's the beautiful thing about having them mapped out on a journey, is that because you have a better sense of where different movements in a piece occur, you can leap to them in your mind and go, that was there. However, one of the things about piano that I'm not able to speak to is that there's a lot of chording and other sorts of directions that come on the sheet music that I'm not familiar with, and I haven't really solved the problem of chording on bass because it's not used, and really there's about maybe 12 or 14 times or something in that area where I've used chords in memorizing Bach. So that's just a problem that I think anybody could solve for themselves if they learn these techniques. It's certainly something that I want to work on with other musicians, especially for guitar. But I don't know if you want me to get into guitar because the question was about piano or bass. But essentially, if you can make a sort of association with every string and with every fret, then you can begin to actually use the fretboard itself as a memory palace. That's kind of getting into advanced strategies, which we'll talk later. But if you can think of a way to make your keyboard a memory palace itself and code it, thinking about location, not necessarily, rote learning your way into the different notes by C, B, C, A, and all these sorts of things backward and forward, then you can begin to see it as territory, and you can territorialize it and map information onto it.
One more question before we are starting our break. There is research stating that there is a correlation between the ability to memorize a lot of things, right, and intelligence. What's your take on that?
It's just absolutely well known that it doesn't just have to do with memorization, although this is totally related. Things like learning languages, it affects brain structures. It affects the actual meat and potatoes, so to speak, of the brain, and it changes the brain. So there's plasticity and development. And specifically with memory, the most detailed research has been with this famous and well-known case where they studied the brains of London taxi drivers, and they showed that particular areas of the brain are just extremely developed. They become tough like leather, so to speak, because they have encoded so much spatial information that they have grown. Now, the problem is, are London taxi drivers more intelligent than you or I because they have developed this spatial memory? They are more intelligent about the city of London, perhaps. They're intelligent about a particular understanding of London, such as where things are located. But they may not have a single clue about a single book in the library that they can locate for you very easily. They may not even know that there's a library on that street, but they know that there is a street, that it has a number 25 on it, and they can find that building. So I'm not saying that taxi drivers aren't intelligent. I have sat in cars with taxi drivers that were incredibly intelligent, but I'm just saying that I don't know that there's a correlation between intelligence and having great memory skills. However, it seems quite likely that if you learn memory skills and you apply it to the accumulation and the acquiring of knowledge, then you will be more intelligent than other people, especially in the kinds of techniques that I'm thinking of, because of how that memory palaces allow you to memorize information en masse and see connections and build knowledge. So, and of course you could do that with other kinds of memory techniques as well. However, I do believe that there are people on the planet throughout history that have become extraordinarily intelligent without any sort of assistance at all. And in any case, what is intelligence, as I was trying to suggest? Taxi drivers can be incredibly intelligent without their knowledge of a city being a part of that.